Oh, wow.
Okay, so it's 10:45, so we're going to get started right now. Hi everyone, welcome to Pain Points and Solutions, bringing data for startups to campus. My name is Dan Hickey, and here are my co-organizers. Kelly, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Kelly LaFleur. I'm the Business Information Librarian for Collections at Vanderbilt University.
Mark Williams, Head of Collections at Vanderbilt Law Library and Lecturer at Law at Vanderbilt Law School.
So how many of you in the room are business librarians? A show of hands. Okay, great number, wonderful. And how many of you are e-resources or e-resources adjacent? Okay, and anyone that we missed? Who are our other people? Just shout out what you're doing.
I'm in AUL for Information Technology at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I've been interested in getting our library more involved in things like patent searching, business intelligence, services, and so on.
Awesome, cool. You also have a vendor, other people? Yeah?
I'm a Master's of Information Science student at UT, and I'm currently in a business research class. So,
A wonderful welcome, yeah, network here. And there's the Brass Cocktail Hour that's being organized by Cynthia tonight at 4:30 at the Victor Social Club. So hopefully we'll see you there and the rest of you there as well. Any other people want to self-identify what they do? Okay, wonderful. We are being recorded, so we're going to try to keep the panel conversational and be in dialogue with you. But keep in mind if there's dirty laundry, we are being recorded. So you may notice us being a little bit cagey about some of our examples. So follow up with us if you want to know more about those specific instances that we might talk about without names attached. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Feel free to interrupt us. We will try to summarize your question for the people who are going to be watching this after the fact. So what is entrepreneurship? Entrepreneurship is a process of fundamental transformation from innovative idea to enterprise and from enterprise to value. One thing that isn't often kind of admitted about entrepreneurship is that 70% to 90% of all startups fail. So this is an intensely emotional process for students and for faculty who are moving these ventures forward. The library across all disciplines can really help connect people with the information and data that they need to be successful. And I think in all of the traditional pieces of entrepreneurship output, you can see that the library has a clear link to them. So more lately, you've seen the business canvas, but business plans are more traditional, and then also pitch decks. So all these different deliverables that can have a library presence. A little bit about the higher ed context. In 2017, there was the campus-wide entrepreneurship ARL spec kit that was produced. And what that survey found is that 83% of all ARL reporting libraries have entrepreneurship as a piece of the strategic mission of the university moving forward. So entrepreneurship is huge. There's so much money being dumped into these pots, these buckets. So there's really an opportunity there for the libraries. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Kaufman report, Kelly?
sure. So, entrepreneurship is being discussed now. It's not to say that it wasn't historically, but I think technology has really helped us grow. So there's a really wonderful report from the Kaufman Foundation in 2007 called Entrepreneurship in American Higher Education. And it does a really nice job of providing a framework for where entrepreneurship belongs. So it talks a little bit about coursework, both in traditional business disciplines, but also in things like music, law, science, and engineering. It talks about scholarships, so faculty doing original research and producing output that helps future entrepreneurs understand the landscape. It talks about internship opportunities for students as they're deciding what to do with their degrees. And it also talks about some of the different ways universities have aided startups and groups coming together while they are still in university before they graduate and focus on their businesses full time. There's a great report, if anyone is a PitchBook subscriber, called PitchBook University. It's produced annually, and it ranks universities by who has the most founders And it does it by gender of the founder, it'll rank unicorn firms, all sorts of fun things. And just like other metrics that business schools are evaluated on, universities are seeing metrics for how they rank in entrepreneurship, and it really is something people are going to look at moving forward.
At NYU, we were just recently scandalized with the Business Week rankings for entrepreneurship because we were so low. We were like, because usually we're used to being in the top 20 for everything and the top 15 for everything, and we were like, oh, we're in the top 50 for entrepreneurship, hurrah! So I think like we're all evaluating where we are. Some quick shout outs, Ken Bolden here in the front row at Cornell was found to be the 6th ranked for universities for startup founders. So we thought that was one cool little factoid.
And so we have a law librarian on our panel, and I know at some universities, law libraries are completely separate, whereas at universities like Vanderbilt and when we were at Cornell, the law library is a part of our library system, and it's another area in which entrepreneurship is really growing that we might not often think about.
Yeah, so just from my own anecdotal experience, I know this can apply now to other universities. Just in my instruction context, like I don't instructions for the all over as well, but just in the last 2 months in my instruction context, it's become very important about how entrepreneurship in a higher ed context can pop up and maybe not necessarily anticipated places, or you wouldn't think about it on the surface, but it really is entrepreneurship. So there's more obvious ones. I teach a 1-credit business and securities legal research course to law students. So some of them are just traditional law students, but some of them are joint degree, MBA, and JDs. Almost all of those students are going to go on to work for firms in some kind of transactional law firm, or either they'll be working for a company that's going to be acquiring a startup. They may be working for a smaller boutique firm that helps startups get off the ground. This requires interdisciplinary resources such as a pitch book or or other kinds of other kinds of databases outside of the traditional legal research realm. You have to think about acquiring, deploying, setting up license agreements that are going to allow you to use those kinds of things. Other areas where I was kind of surprised that, or maybe not on the surface, we realize that it's an entrepreneurship situation is that we have legal clinics. Obviously, every law school has some kind of legal clinics, but we have specifically a transactional clinic called the Community Enterprise Clinic. It's all law students, but they almost exclusively service startups getting off of the ground. And those students, they're lawyers, but they need to know about what types of documents. How do I set up an LLC? How do I set up bylaws for a particular kind of company? What's the best entity formation for this type of state? So those kind of contexts, that's very much entrepreneurship. They're serving real world clients. It's no longer theoretical to them. It becomes very much an entrepreneurship question. And then the other aspect, just 2 weeks ago, it kind of combines everything we were talking about. Vanderbilt has a, what do you call it, tech transfer innovation workspace called the Wondery. Would that be the best way to describe what the Wondery is?
It's a business accelerator, and it's actually more closely related to the engineering college than the business college, but the business and law library staff work closely with them.
There's one course in particular that I went in and was guest lectured for called Innovation Realization, and it combines 1 PhD student, usually from science or from a medical background, 2 MBAs, 2 JDs, and they put them in a team. And they take the thesis of the PhD and then the JDs and the MBAs look for business opportunities, intellectual property opportunities, and throughout the course of the year, they sort of flesh out a business plan. So it requires legal work, it requires MBA work, and there's a lot of like hidden, nobody in there is necessarily thinking entrepreneurship right away, but it combines aspects of all of this that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And I just, these opportunities are all over the place at our campus, and I know they're at other campuses as well.
And other opportunities really outside of the classroom we have impact with. There is competitions on campus. Sometimes the prize is just a glory, but sometimes there are monetary prizes. For example, one of my colleagues worked with a bunch of groups at our Wondery, and she alone last year helped those groups get $75,000 worth of funding based on the project she helped them with. When Dan and I worked together at Cornell, we supported a case competition based in the School of Hotel Administration. And I remember vividly working with a group called Ithaca Hummus that was looking for research on the hummus market. And that was at this point about 4 or 5 years ago. And now I'm in Nashville and I can buy this hummus in any Publix. So they're in over 30 different states. And this was a project that started when they were undergraduates. And now this is a real business for them. They're making a profit. And I know my help spend is 0.001% of this business, but I always think of the fondly the real world impact we have with students as young as freshmen.
So it's not just consumer packaged goods, like this really, the disciplines that are being pulled into entrepreneurship really run the gamut. So there's research coming out of Harvard that shows that the most successful startups have a technical founder and then also business expertise on their team, typically an MBA. At NYU, we have art business and we have music business programs. And even though those may sound more academic and more humanities focused, they really are entrepreneurial programs, which is kind of exciting. So what we're seeing across our campuses is that the teams are hyper interdisciplinary. Entrepreneurship is touching every disciplines that we never thought that we would see. And so as our users are de-siloing, we really need to, in the libraries, de-silo. So the obvious examples are business and law, but also medical, working with biomedical startups. And then I think a lot of vendors don't necessarily understand like how these resources are being used. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. One example that we wanted to bring to the front was Yale. So Erin Wukovich at Yale has done a really great job at knitting together a group of interdisciplinary librarians and also selectors who are, really buying for entrepreneurs and also debuting different services that are really focused on that. So if any of you have a service mission in addition to your collections work, her live guide and just talking to Erin is really wonderful. Let us know if you want her contact information or you can look her up. And then we should also say that there are many different units within the university who are thinking about entrepreneurship. So it's not just the library, it's not just the business college, it's not just the entrepreneurship unit, there are also a lot of research centers and public and private partnerships. So one example from, so Kelly and I were both at Cornell, and we had a pre-seed workshop. It was a small biomedical and life sciences startup. And so some of the teams were Cornell teams, but many of the teams included large portions of founders who were not affiliated with the university. And so you can imagine it's wonderful to have at least one of your students on each of these startup teams, but what's the implication for the licensing of the resources? So that's something that, for example, the CRL model license isn't really helping you with. And then you add data on top of that, and it quickly escalates into a situation where it's much more challenging to connect your entrepreneurs with the information they need to be successful. So we had to walk a fine line for that collaboration. And my understanding is that at Cornell, that fine line is still being walked. And I think, how many of you have been in that situation where it's an official university initiative, but there are many people who are not technically enrolled or employed on those teams? Okay, so lots of hands going up.
And we'll go more into this when we talk about licenses. So something we found preparing for this presentation, there's a fair amount written about supporting entrepreneurship with spaces in your library. There's a fair amount written about programming, things that we do like patent searching, but there's really not a lot with challenges based on clauses in our licenses and how we support our patrons who are students or faculty that are part of the university but they're working on these commercial ventures. And that was my biggest takeaway from the spec kit, is that I feel like there needed to be more discussion. Another context of this is really the emphasis on data and many of our resources in startups. And we felt like this was an area where the libraries are really growing and supporting. So at my institution, we joined the Software Carpentries, and no one is familiar with that. It is an international program where instructors can be certified to teach these various data courses. You can pay these instructors to come to your campus, or if you get someone certified on your campus, you can work with them. One of the challenges is they have a lot of sample curriculums, but nothing business specific. So they have social science data work, but it's not quite the same. So there's a lot we can do with that. We actually offer this course just for our ON MBA students, and we set it to 25 because we have 3 instructors and we felt like that was a good ratio. It sold out in 5 minutes, and we had 25 people on the wait list that tried to get in 10 minutes later. So there's definitely kind of a demand, which requires us really to be licensing and providing data for students to learn the coding skills that they'll need to be successful in programs, and also those who go into traditional business roles.
To build on that, if you're not familiar with data for entrepreneurs, there's a book called Lean Analytics, Use Data to Build a Better Startup Faster. So if you're trying to bootstrap into really understanding these needs and why entrepreneurs are coming to us with these data questions, I think that's kind of the best way to get a user-centered look at them. In terms of faculty who are doing entrepreneurship research, they really want the data fire hose. And so libraries are not really equipped to handle these requests for data feeds. So at NYU, we're really lucky in that the business school has built out these fluencies and technical proficiencies so to have these data feeds coming in. So the big example that we have is Crunchbase, where the library could never actually, with our IT infrastructure, facilitate the amount of data that's coming through. And to do the research, Crunchbase Premium is really not going to be enough. So I think, where was I going with that? Data feeds. So data feeds, it's wonderful to have like a high performance computing partner that can help you do that. But if this is the future of scholarship, we really need to be thinking about, what does that mean for the organization in terms of services, but then also how are we advocating for that on the top level when it comes to doing contract work? Do you want to do that?
I will. So in my particular role, I am the words manager also for the business school in addition to being a librarian. And this has been a real learning curve for me because when I purchase things through the library, I have a great e-resources team. When I'm working with the business school, it's myself, maybe the head of a research center, and a couple of faculty members. So we have looked at different data feeds, and I have the skills to help acquire this, figure out the infrastructure we need, but ultimately the funding is coming from them, and that also usually means restrictions. So I'm helping faculty get what they need, but that doesn't mean that every student at our university will then have access to this data feed, but it does mean the faculty doing research are able to get what they need. So sometimes we have to be a little creative and do things that in the library we might not love to do. One-time data purchases, I've learned very quickly you cannot own that data. There is a time limit at which you have to destroy the data. There are vendors who might not realize an academic peer review process could take 2 years, and that's totally normal. I had a vendor say, well, I'll give you a discount if you keep it for 3 months. I said, what are my faculty doing for 3 months? So these are all kind of different challenges that we have, but we can take the skills we have negotiating library resources and help our faculty negotiating some of the resources that they need.
Yeah, and I kind of touched on in the legal context important of legal documents, and especially for startups setting, traditionally go to the IP-based patent searching realm, which is important. It's foundational to that type of work. But we start, especially just in the 5 years that I've been in law, I'm going to start to see these more complex data questions as well, or very specific, especially mergers and acquisitions, transactional type questions that we get. Like just 2 weeks ago, I wanted to know. I want to know what the standard royalty rate is for this type of patent in this medical industry. This was a legal question I was given, and that requires a very different type of database and data needs than I would usually offer. That requires a capital IQ or something else along those lines that we wouldn't have traditionally provided. Thankfully, in the last couple of years, we now have that. It's definitely an example of where some of these types of questions and information needs are coming from.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit and begin to talk about collaborating to do purchasing. So one example that comes from NYU is recently we acquired PitchBook. And so many people at the university wanted access to PitchBook. How many of you want PitchBook but don't yet have it? Okay, a couple people. How many of you actually have it? Okay, so a good number.
Don't
So,
want it.
don't have it, don't want it. Fair enough, fair enough. So one thing we did at NYU is we worked with the business school. The library will be purchasing it. We own the contract, and the business school will have kind of a step-down approach where for the first 3 years they will be contributing an amount that goes towards it, but it gets smaller each year, and at the end it's on the library budget. That was kind of the compromise that we needed to be able to get PitchBook into the university. And then at Cornell, we had an example where we were splitting the Frost & Sullivan subscription, which is a medical market research and industrial market research database, with the pre-seed workshop that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. It's really more of an art than a science of figuring out how to cost share with a particular school, whether that's a business school, law school, or a faculty group. And one of the kind of challenges is the hidden labor of who owns the contract. So it's not just about the invoicing logistics, although those can be very complicated, but figuring out who does the license go to? Who signs things? It's probably different for who signs library resources than who signs resources that faculty are purchasing with separate funds. Depending on what kind of software your university uses, you might have to split the cost directly and pay the vendor together, or one department pays the other department behind the scenes. And kind of making sure that that process goes on can take more time than you think that it does. So it's definitely worth it to collaborate, to find funding from other sources to get resources, but we do need to account for the time in learning a different process or how a different college buys data, and then also making sure that we have everything we need to make sure that contracts don't expire without anyone knowing about it, payments go out on time. We have everything we need to make sure we're proxying resources and we're deploying them out to all the communities who are covered in the license.
We have too much content, so we're just jumping to the important stuff.
I keep joking that this presentation should be a book, but I'm not volunteering myself to write it, but with collaborators. So another challenge we definitely have in this area is premium prices. And depending on the institution you're at, budgets can really shift. Sometimes if you're at a public school versus a private school, it impacts how you can spend those budgets. For example, I don't love to do it, but at Vanderbilt, there are times I have to buy something just for our business community, and it's the only way we can afford it. We have a graduate program. We don't have an undergraduate business major, and because we're a smaller sized group, it's the only way I can get the price to be what it needs to be. It's also challenging when your faculty come from other institutions and they realize they don't have access to things they used to. So I'm a liaison to a faculty member who came to us from Harvard, and it was a shock for her, I'm sure you all know. And she goes, well, I'm an alumni, I'll just call them up and they're gonna send me this market data. And I kind of laughed and I said, I know who you're gonna call up and ask, and I'm curious how it goes, knowing how it will go. But they don't realize, because we've been so seamless behind the scenes of providing access to things, that not every business school has the same resource, especially with words. I don't think faculty often realize the work that goes into negotiating the individual data sets in words. Related to this also can be the power of negotiation. So these are some strategies that I've used to get resources to my groups. I don't love to do one-time polls, but we do it for faculty. We have had times where they've allowed us to really own that data, which I would say more often happens with vendors who understand libraries. But we've also had to do it with data sets for faculty to get the work they need. We also, Dan will go into this a little bit, but have a lot of back channel discussions. I know I've had them with multiple people in this room to figure out, how did you get this resource? Were you able to strike clauses from the license? What kind of pricing did they offer you? As we all know, we do not get offered the same pricing. And if we're allowed to talk about pricing, depending on what kind of confidentiality clauses and anything we signed, it really helps us to be on the same page. It's also important to leverage what I'll call your limitations. So our institution not having undergraduates has really helped us with some of our pricing. And a lot of these resources are actually campus-wide. The vendor just based the pricing on who they think the primary user group is. So these resources are available to law students, all undergraduate students, but the pricing is based on the primary users, which to me is a huge win as a librarian in getting resources on campus. My other kind of success has been when a vendor doesn't have the IT infrastructure to limit a resource, they will sell it to us at the cost of our group. and then have it campus-wide. So sometimes the vendor is okay with it, sometimes they're not, but they can't offer that IT solution that works with easy proxy, or they can't find a way to limit a module within a larger context. So then they say, well, we don't know what to do. Eventually, we might know how to limit this, but for now, you can do it campus-wide, which is another win for all of our students, since there are students outside of business who need these business resources.
Another way to try to mitigate the premium prices problem is to work consortially. So I think this is the one place where the business library community maybe could be doing more and more sophisticated work. I would point to Jason in the back, Jason Sokoloff, as one of the people who really helped crack the PitchBook open for the academic market. So the Association of Business Library Directors, some of whom are in this room, really worked closely with PitchBook to make sure that they had an academic contract. Part of that was even a visit to PitchBook's facility as well. So, you know, I think we are slowly bringing more of these corporate style people into the academic sphere. But I think when we can do that in a way that leverages many institutions instead of just one institution, I think that's where we'll begin to see essentially better contracts that better reflect the types of knowledge creation, scholarship, and entrepreneurship that's going on campus.
And related to this, I think the way in which we can grow with some of the disagreements we have is getting vendors to better understand why we need bulk downloading. So there are many products we have, or in theory we have all of, for example, call transcripts, but they're either not in the right format, or if they are in the right format, let's say they're XML files, you can't bulk download them. And a lot of times we end up paying for something twice, because we have the user-friendly product that might work for a student doing an entrepreneurship course, but we don't have the bulk download a faculty member needs to look for trends over time. For example, something like Factiva. I get questions a couple times a year, every year, oh, I'd love to bulk download all this content that we have and run some type of analysis on it. A lot of times they have coding skills that they don't. We actually do have someone in the library who can help, but that particular resource has a clause where we're not allowed to do that. PitchBook is one where downloads are very limited and we can educate our users, but there's specifics in the clause where they've over-anticipated our coding skills. So they said, even if you can figure out how to bulk download and scrape this data, you are forbidden from doing that. So that's one where the vendor kind of has been more forward thinking, and I think we have room to kind of grow there, and just like they're anticipating the future, we can anticipate the future and try to have kind of more leverage so we're not buying things multiple times because they're not in the format for the wide array of research that's happening on campus.
Another example that kind of builds on that is the LexisNexis REST API. If you want to query that, you need a lot of technical skills. Some organizations have built a user interface to query that API, but recently they switched to a new API. Have you guys heard about this? And so everyone's user-centered interface broke all at once. It has not yet been fixed. And so now, like, if you want to query their corpus, you really have to have Python skills. And so that's one thing, like, at NYU, we have a data services unit that's super responsive and can help people with that work. But if you don't have that kind of unit that's really closely working with people who need those skills, it kind of shuts that resource off to a lot of people.
I was going to say, there's two things we want to touch on. We're going to get to best practices, so this isn't just a session of us complaining.
What's wrong with that?
But more with people who understand. So another kind of issue with these restrictive corporate licenses is that vendors will try to take some kind of ownership over what's created, or they want approval for what's created. So I've seen everything from a vendor asking for abstracts for every faculty work that plans on being published. I've seen vendors ask for how they want their data to be cited. I've seen vendors say they want rights to own that work and publish it wherever they would like, which really shows they have no idea how academic publishing works. And oftentimes there are certain things they are not willing to strike. And I spoke with a vendor recently and better understood there was a particular academic institution who disclosed too much information from the data set they bought, and that really made the clients of that vendor angry. So the vendor came back with a very specific license, and that's kind of our crossroads. And it's a challenge because those aren't our rights to get. those aren't even the faculty members' rights to give, and until they understand that, we can't sign things and get faculty the data they need that is that restricted. I also wanted to quickly go back to the spec kit that I mentioned at first, and we don't intend this session to be going too backwards, we want to move forwards. The majority of people who took this entrepreneurship kit said that they did not feel they had issues with their license agreements and they did not have to revise them to support entrepreneurs. And that kind of baffled me. And a lot of people said, oh, we have a walk-in clause. And this is where it comes in that not all librarians are experts in contract reading, maybe the lawyers, but for the rest of us. Your walk-in clause does not negate the clauses that say no commercial use. And I think there's a really fundamental misunderstanding in conferences like this that are bringing together people from acquisitions, e-resources, and selectors are a really good way for us to come together and kind of work through these challenges in our contracts.
We're going to move speedily along to best practices, so that we can have some time for Q&A at the end. So our first best practice is to begin building relationships with stakeholders. So that means, understanding the needs of your users, reaching out to entrepreneurship centers on campus, but then also doing the inReach within your library. So I think one thing that we've both seen is that you really need to work closely with your e-resources librarian so that they understand the slate of challenges that you're facing. I can't remember if anyone in the room knows who does this, please let me know, but there is one ARL business library that lists on their website which databases can be used for profit. And I think that's the next level thing that we need to be doing. We need to be advocating for that. So that's our first best practice.
And kind of when we talk about de-siloing, we mean within the library, but also within the colleges. So I think it's easy for us to do a better job of communicating within the library, but to work with some research centers, they might be in the college you're liaison to, they might not, you have these needs and bring people together. I found a lot of departments have funding they don't know what to do with, and they're happy to provide it to a resource, they just need someone else to do the legwork. We've actually, so Mark and I have been at Vanderbilt for, Mark about 2 years, myself about 1.5 years, and we've identified a lot of resources that would benefit both the business school and the law library, and that we've been able to work together and get pretty fair pricing for both of our users. And I know before this, I didn't realize how law students would, for example, use Capital IQ to look at takeover defenses. And the pricing for working together is much better than it would be for looking at these as two separate colleges. And just knowing the way entrepreneurship is working in the law school has really helped me as a business selector to understand why I want to get resources campus-wide as often as possible, but when we can't do that, to look with partners, engineering libraries, business libraries, to bring these resources to other communities because I know they need them as much as my users do.
Yeah, and I think, and some of that, just in the best practices, particularly in the negotiation phase, I think a lot of times we focus on what the vendor is offering, what's in the contract, but it is a negotiation phase, and I think it's important that there's a duty that lies on the part of the person on the librarian to try to anticipate and articulate as many possible use cases as they can to the vendors. And then, especially when we're talking about vendors going from a corporate area into an academic area. And it may just be that they just don't know, especially if they're newer. A lot of these newer databases, they're into the academic market for the first time. They're just not going to know. And it's not necessarily that you're going to have a win every time or that it's going to be perfect every time, but running through that mental exercise of what is every possible use case that I can have, because I think that really is a burden that is on the librarian to articulate in that negotiation phase. If you're past the negotiation phase, then maybe there's a window, I don't know. But I think that's maybe an overlooked part of best practices there. And that way, not just reduces, but you're future-proofing everything. You're kind of balancing the risk if you can by trying to anticipate every possible use that could be out there. Making it easy for the user to understand what they can and cannot do with these databases. I know at law, I think business is like this as well sometimes because we're so fearful, we make the users fearful in just the wording and the way of what you can and can't do. And sometimes they need to be fearful, sometimes there needs to be a statement of what you can't do.
When a student says, my internship wants me to bulk download this pitch book data and it says I can only do 10 a day, and they come into the library, we have these conversations, but I will add that not all liaisons are selectors, and I take for granted that I have to read all of the licenses, but my peers do not, so there's some education even there that we need to work together because we're all supporting the students.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes into kind of focusing on teaching skills too, teaching not just students what they can and cannot do and how to use these databases most effectively, what they're capable of, but teaching librarians, e-resources librarians, potentially also if you work in a unit where somebody who signs the contract is not a librarian, they're a financial unit manager somewhere else, you can't assume that they're going to be able to understand every sort of, they're going to have questions about what you're trying to do with some of these contracts and the agreements that you're entering into. You can't assume that knowledge that you need to start early at kind of building stakeholders.
Yeah, that's a good transition point to our key takeaways. So our key takeaways are build a team and advocate as a team. Do not advocate as an individual because that's just not how things work any longer. You have to build relationships that are outside the library as well. Send out all those feelers. Make sure that when a hard decision needs to be made or when a new prioritization has been identified, that you have those relationships with decision makers that can actually help you move things forward. The need to better educate library staff around licenses, I think is something that we all need to be doing. What does the license actually say, I think is kind of the foundation for that. And so I think communally we need to be thinking about what does that contract language look like. That's something that I think is a piece of low-hanging fruit that the business librarian community can begin moving forward. And then also think about partnering with vendors to help them understand us and for us to better understand them. I think that's an example of the vendor coming back and saying, like, you've angered one of our data providers. Like, we can't have an us versus them mentality. We really need to build out partnerships that are mutually beneficial. I'm trying not to say synergistic. So. Okay. No buzzwords today. So we've just talked a lot. Any questions from the audience?
Or commiseration.
I'll just say, +1 for everything. I'm Jason Sokoloff, previously called out, thank you, from University of Washington. And I think that one of the things that, I think that this may correspond to a lot of libraries, but I'm purchasing things for the business library, but I'm within the university library's org chart, right? So that's where the budget's coming from for the most part. And I think a lot of the resistance is not necessarily from all those other factors that you described, but from that, just the way libraries have always operated.
Right.
And this idea of like, well, we're not going to subscribe to something that forces people to create their own account. Well, that cuts off a lot of business, possibilities. They always part of that. Or this idea of like shared funding. I mean, that's taken, cultivation and working with the acquisitions librarian to know like this is going to look messy because it's going to be cost sharing and different departments are paying for it, but we're still managing it. So I feel like there's and just the idea of licensing, like we'll just, this perception that whatever we buy, whatever people can access, they should be able, they're allowed to access. It's this constant communication. If you really are writing a book and looking for co-authors,
People in this room could write this book.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much to learn from it, and but the good thing about this is that I feel like probably business librarianship and business materials are like we're ahead of the curve. I mean, I think it's only a matter of time before all of the academic-friendly publishers are kind of moving in this direction. Providing data in addition to search interfaces, and I think we, by cultivating these good practices now with things that are seemingly business only, it's going to impact everybody. So the more we can convince our colleagues who are not in business librarianship, the better off we'll all be.
Jason's really put his finger on the fact that essentially the old workflows and the old policies of kind of the library system writ large are no longer meeting the needs of researchers and entrepreneurs. Other comments? Cynthia?
I just want to clarify that the brass cocktail hour is being sponsored by Reference USA, so I want to give them a call out.
Thank you, Reference USA.
We use their data product with entrepreneurs all the time, yeah.
Absolutely.
Jeff, shout out. You're not here, but we love you. Ken?
Have you ever had any situations where the vendor will be willing to sell you access to the whole campus, but not the incubator, so they want to sell them a separate license? Have you had to negotiate that?
That happens with tech transfer offices and some of those groups or alumni relations that do very big things when they're looking into the network of alumni. That is something this year, I have a tech transfer office employee who's in our executive MBA program, so I'm learning a lot just from him, and that's been accidental collaboration where he was not realizing all these resources we had, which maybe we shouldn't be using them for that, so that's good. But talking about looking into the future with vendors, and there are things we've purchased multiple times on campus for groups like that, and if there's a way to get them together, I think that would save a lot of time and energy. But doing our due diligence and making sure we can't control what people are using. If someone is on our IT range in the tech transfer office and they can jump into the database and we know that, but making sure our contracts say we will do our best to prohibit and not you are responsible if this happens. And they're normally willing to change that language. That's one of the first things I look for in agreements because we just don't have the ability to police all of these things.
And I should say that some vendors are happy to work with entrepreneurs. So I think the standout example is Jared Hoppenfelder at University of Texas. I might be actually destroying his name, thank you. But he worked with the veterans group, the Veteran Entrepreneurs Group, which I know a lot of our universities have worked with, to get free access to resources for those entrepreneurs who are not affiliated with the universities. So I think like we need to be building those bridges and we can point to those examples.
I learned yesterday from Mintel, if anyone is familiar with Mintel, that they're actually working with a bunch of startups in the food and beverage space and kind of creating this reciprocal relationship where they're providing information on what they're doing that is giving more information to their databases, and then Mintel is able to take that, make products, and sell them to us, but they're letting those groups use their products at universities for some of this commercial use. And her name was Sarah, who happens to be my rep. I'm not sure if she's your rep, and I'm sorry I forget her last name, but that to me is kind of the future, how, yeah, we can be working together in these ways, and vendors can get benefits from working with us, and we can get resources to students who really want to make their ideas into real businesses after school. So I think that's kind of a positive looking into the future, that more vendors will want to collaborate like that.
Just one final thing for Ken. I also, like when we brought PitchBook on board, I emailed the tech transfer office and I was like, don't cancel your subscription because our subscription does not cover you. So like just letting them know exactly where they stand, your constituents, I think is super important. Corey, did you have a question?
I was just going to add, when we, at the University of Michigan, when we license for, if we license for Ann Arbor campus, it's wall to wall.
Mm-hmm.
And we make it really clear. And we're running into problems actually in the law, Mark, in the law library side, because our business law faculty want Westlaw. And they're not covered because they don't teach at the law school. And I think Vanderbilt has a different arrangement because that's what Hillary said. But we, for us,
smart spots.
we really aspire to let people know how to use it, but we can't police it, just as Kelly said. And then fundamentally, you know, I'm looking over at Joanne. When we're dealing with ProQuest and Gale and Info Group, they know the library field, they know how we work, they know what we do, and they're good. When we're dealing with a commercial vendor, all they see is the potential of 60,000 accounts, and they have every right to freak out. And so that's where we get a lot of pushback, and it's just a matter of every so often we have to agree to things that may not be ideal if we're going to get the resources that we need.
One, just to build on that, so NYU has a huge business school, and then we have 3 global campuses And so we were working with a vendor who, wanted to quote us this really unreasonable amount. And I was like, if you just like take the average of Yale and this other university and see how many accounts they have, like that's probably how many accounts we're going to have. So I think managing expectations is so critical on that front.
We're happy to take more questions, but I know this session time is officially over, so I will not be offended if you want to eat lunch. All of our contact information is here. We're really happy to continue this discussion. I know we talk about things like this at ALA's Grass, at SLA, the ABLP group, but sometimes it's really nice to all get people in these different associations together in a room because we really do learn from each other. We so value your feedback, and we really look forward to continuing these discussions either online or at the next conference when our groups come together.